Corsair, Apple Floppy Days, Commodore, Tandy Floppy Days, Atari, TI Floppy Days. The weekend comes, the disk drive hums, ready to code for you. These days we're all happy and free. Those floppy days, the games we played, you shared with me. Those days, Motorola, Intel 6502, graphics and text are there to view. Composite, color, or RGB, program fun for you and me.
Floppy Days is recorded in a live studio.
Inside PC Floppy Days, ST Amiga Floppy Days, Junior Sinclair Floppy Days, Classic Days, Microwaves, geeking all week with you. These days we're all happy and free. Those floppy days, the games we played, you shared with me. Those days, these floppy days are yours and mine. These floppy days are yours and mine. Floppy days.
The TRS-80 Model 3.
Introducing the Apple IIc.
Atari 1040 ST.
Commodore 64. What?
PC Junior, new from IBM.
Discover Atari.
To his Radio Shack Color Computer 3.
Introducing the Timex Sinclair 1000.
For computer, this is the one. Texas Instruments home computer.
A wonder computer of the 1980s. The Commodore VIC-20.
Hello and welcome to episode 148 of the Floppy Days Podcast for February 2025, where computers of the late 70s through the 80s are the apple of our eye. And if you got that pun, you're in the right place. First off, I wanted to mention that this month is the 12th anniversary of the publication of the very first episode of Floppy Days, way back in 2013. That's right, it's been 12 years. A very small percentage of podcasts ever reach that sort of longevity. In fact, I can only think of one other podcast that's in my sphere of listening that has been regularly produced for that long or longer, that being the retro MacCast. I should be so lucky to produce a podcast as long as the 18 years that James and John have done with retro MacCast. There are several reasons I keep doing this. I love talking about old computers. I love being able to interview incredible people that were actively part of the microcomputer revolution. I love feedback from listeners. And it keeps me out of trouble now that I'm retired from the daily grind of the workforce. This podcast wouldn't still be going if you weren't listening. The listenership actually has been pretty stable for the past several years, and I'm humbled and honored that so many continue to listen and provide feedback. Thanks to you and your support, what do you say let's keep this thing going till you and I both are tired of it? Okay, now into details about this particular episode. I've been very focused recently on producing interviews with some amazing guests. Frankly, this will always remain an important part of this podcast, as the individuals who were the main drivers in microcomputers will unfortunately only be around for an increasingly shorter period of time. However, the main focus is, and always will be, covering the vast array of unique machines that existed in the late 70s through the 80s. I will admit that the amount of research and work to publish the microcomputer specific shows is a lot, considerably more than the interview episodes. However, as I said, covering vintage computers and programmable calculators is the main impetus for this podcast. It has been a full year since we covered a vintage machine, so it's time to remedy that. To that end, in this episode, we will be covering a vintage machine, the HP97 and 67 programmable calculator. I speak of them as one because, as we will cover in great detail, they are internally the same machine, with the main difference being the built-in printer for the HP97. I was very fortunate to get a fantastic co-host for this episode, HP calculator historian Wlodek Mier-Jedrzejowicz. And yes, I checked with Wlodek to make sure I was pronouncing his name correctly, so I think it's pretty close. Wlodek has a tremendous amount of knowledge and experience with the HP calculators, and I think you'll find his stories and background extremely interesting and helpful as we go through the history of the HP67 and 97. In this episode, we'll be spending a few minutes to get to know Wlodek, then together we will cover the history of the 6797. As another bonus, I also was able to catch up with another gentleman who has a lot of history with HP, Everett Kaser. Longtime listeners will recall that Everett worked for HP for so many years on several of their calculators and desktop computers, and helped with co-hosting the Floppy Days series of episodes on the HP Series 80. It turns out that Everett had spent some time at HP repairing the HP97, and he shares his memories of those times. Based on the amount of material that was generated about this calculator, it looks as though we're going to have 3 episodes on the 97/67, with the first being this one on history and memories, the second covering tech specs and several other topics, and a third episode to finish off coverage. I should mention that the HP97 episodes do veer from the established timeline a bit, whereas I've been covering the machines that were introduced in 1982, with the last one being covered, the Grundy New Brain. The HP97/67 were introduced in 1976. By rights, the HP97 should have been covered in a very early episode of Floppy Days, just after the MIT's Altair 8800 and in the same general time frame as the Apple I. However, I felt it was important to go back and pick up this machine, so I hope you will forgive me for departing from the timeline order for this. Before we go on, let's not forget to mention some of the great storefronts that support our vintage computing hobby in a big way. Those being 8bitclassics.com, run by my friend Corey Colts. He has a lot of things like video cables, power supplies, PC boards, cartridges, etc. for a wide variety of vintage computer platforms. I often get things from Corey and his 8-Bit Classics, and he's been a friend of the show for some time. I really appreciate his support of the podcast. Check out his site. And another is arcadeshopper.com, run by my friend Greg McGill. Greg really has a wide variety of often hard to find items for a large number of platforms. This is another site I do a lot of shopping at. I've mentioned many times on Floppy Days. And the nice thing is, if anything shows out of stock, you can just ping Greg and he can check whether he has more of the item or can get more of the item for you. And finally, FutureVision Research, a vendor managed by my friend Brian Cox. Brian has been very generous to the show, and if you're in need of a FujiNet for any of the official platforms like the Apple II, Atari 8-Bit, Coco, or Coleco Atom, Brian has what you need. He also has some cool soldering kits for whatever skill level you're at, including beginner. And I have all of these soldering kits. Brian is in the process right now of sending me a soldering kit from VCF SoCal. So this was a badge soldering kit that was made specifically for VCF SoCal. So I want to thank Brian for his support of the podcast as well. For all of these storefronts, when you place an order, please mention Floppy Days in the notes or comments of the order. For 8-Bit Classics, you can actually just use the link I provide in the show notes, and it will automatically give credit for the sale to Floppy Days. However, more generally, if you hear about anything in this podcast that you decide you want or need to purchase, please mention Floppy Days, and doing so will help support the podcast. Many, many thanks. I also want to mention that there are several listeners who appreciate the show enough to donate through patreon.com. I really appreciate you guys, and it helps offset the cost of running the podcast. A new supporter I want to mention is the Call Apple user group. I have regularly been providing content for their monthly magazine recently, and I'm very pleased and appreciative of their support of the podcast. Regarding that, I've created some tiers for paid members through Patreon, and have come up with some ways to reward those who are generous enough to monetarily support the Floppy Days podcast on Patreon. Rewards you can get are early access to videos of interviews, like the one being brought to you in audio form in this episode. Visit patreon.com to see more details concerning the rewards for supporters. Final thought on that is that I want you to know it's always my intention to make all content available to everyone at no cost, while at the same time providing some benefits for those generous enough to support the podcast. I hope you agree I've come up with a good compromise. Please let me know your thoughts, as always, and enjoy the rest of the podcast.
Hi, this is Wlodek Mier-Jedrzejowicz. I've been an HP calculator fan since the first HP handheld calculator, which I used at my physics with mathematics undergrad course at Imperial College in London. And I've been using more and more HP calculators ever since. They are now available on emulators on your smartphone. But it's still worth using a real one. I've written books about them. We still run a club where people can meet either online or physically. It's been wonderful talking about these on Floppy Days, and I hope you come back to Floppy Days.
Okay, now for new acquisitions and what I've been up to. First up, I wanted to talk about all the items I've gotten recently for my IBM PC 5140 convertible. I haven't yet covered the IBM 5140 on Floppy Days, but it will be. But it's a pretty nice portable machine. I got the one I have in the Great Barn Find of 2022, as it was well packaged and in very good condition from being in the barn for who knows how many years. It was in the original IBM branded case that originally came with it, but the case itself didn't survive the many years in the elements. I took this machine to VCF Southeast last summer in Atlanta with a display of portable machines. I actually had issues booting the machine into DOS or BASIC while at VCF Southeast, and was looking for ways to get it working and to add some optional items to it to get the maximum use out of it. One of the unique things about this machine is the fact there are numerous cards you can get for it, and whereas on the IBM PC Junior, the cards attach to the right side and extend the machine in that direction, on this machine, they chose to have the cards attached to the back, so it extends the length rather than the width. John Guidry was at VCF Southeast. He's a friend of mine, and it turned out he was a bit of a fan of these machines and had purchased some of the new old stock items some time ago from one of the vendors that still has inventory of this stuff. He offered to sell me some items and help me get the right boot disks for the machine, so we worked out what I needed and or wanted, and a package arrived a couple weeks after the show with all the stuff. The first thing that I wanted to mention in that package was a thermal printer. Some time ago, I had already purchased one card to add video options and another to add serial and parallel ports to the machine. Each of those cards adds about 2 inches to the length of the machine. The one remaining card that I wanted to get was a thermal printer that IBM made for it. Now that card's a little bigger. It adds more length to your computer, and adding it actually makes the computer almost comically long, but does add a nice thermal printer to it. You can actually hook it up to the computer via cable instead, if you prefer that over having an unnaturally long portable. I haven't hooked this up to the computer yet, but will do so soon. I'll just have to make sure I have a long table to put the computer on in order to use it. John also had an IBM labeled compact printer that he wanted to sell. Now I normally try to avoid picking up vintage printers as I don't really miss them and they can take a lot of room and care. However, this one could be connected to the IBM PC Junior I have, and the name compact in the name made me think it could be really small. Bad assumption on that part. The printer is not only not as small as I would like, but it's also very heavy and probably contributed the most to the shipping cost to the total package required. Well, there are much larger printers out there, so I guess in that regard it is fairly small. John also sent me some proper boot disks for the computer, which I didn't have, and which were probably preventing me from booting up the machine properly. Or at least I hope that's why it wasn't booting up properly. And finally, the 5140's 256K of RAM can actually be expanded internally. So I had John throw in a 128K RAM card so I can expand the RAM at some point. And that's all of the IBM PC 5140 convertible items I've acquired recently. Next up, some paint for my TRS-80s. On a previous episode of Floppy Days, I talked about a recent pickup of a large amount of Tandy stuff at the home of David and Teresa Welsh. Of course, many of the items, which were multiple TRS-80 Model 1s, a Model 3, multiple expansion interfaces, and multiple Model 1 monitors, are all the Mercedes silver that invariably get scratched or worn off with use. Plus, I already had a large amount of the gray Tandy stuff before this pickup. While at Tandy Assembly, Scott Ellentuck had some cans of the official matching TRS-80 Mercedes silver that he had acquired from a nearby company with a custom order. I thought really hard about buying one at the show, at that time knowing I had some touch-up I could do with the TRS-80 stuff I already had. This was prior to the pickup at the Welsh's, so the need was there, but less. So I didn't buy it there. However, after the Welsh pickup, I really needed a full can of the stuff, so I contacted Scott and ordered a can. I really regretted not buying a can at the show at this point, as the paint had to be shipped as hazardous material and thus wasn't cheap to ship. Now I just need to take the time to touch up all of my Tandy equipment that can use a refresh. I have high hopes that I can make some of these items look as good as new. Next up, some items for my Atari ST. A while back, I talked a bit about an Atari Mega STE, the last and best version of the Atari ST line, not counting the TT and Falcon, which I had acquired from Germany. Unfortunately, that machine did not come with a keyboard, which isn't unusual. However, I already have a Mega ST, not STE, that has a keyboard, and that keyboard can be used on the Mega ST or the Mega STE. Now, there were two main designs of the keyboard, one with the joystick and mouse ports very inconveniently placed underneath the keyboard, and one with the joystick and mouse ports placed properly on the sides. Either keyboard is electrically the same and can be used on either the Mega ST or Mega STE. My Mega ST keyboard is the early design, and I always hated the placement of the joystick and mouse ports. But I had it hooked up to the Mega STE for now. Through the Atari Bitbiters Users Club, or ABAC, which is an Atari-specific user group with a terrific newsletter, and which I highly recommend you join, based in Germany, I had the opportunity to acquire a new keyboard with the proper mouse and joystick port placement, while also having the payment being a donation to a worthwhile charity. So I was able to get my name on the new keyboard first, and was excited to get an improved keyboard shipped to me that matches my Mega STE in form and function. This particular keyboard turned out to be the German version, as you might suspect with it coming from Germany. That basically means the Y and Z keys are swapped from an English keyboard. That's the main difference, but there are a few other special character keys that are different. It's only right that a German Mega STE has a German keyboard on it, although it certainly happened in a roundabout way. I guess it was destiny. Finally, I acquired another ST item, this one being a side cartridge multi-device emulator crafted for the Atari ST, STE, and Mega series. It comes with all the connectors pre-soldered and is ready to plug in to a Raspberry Pi Pico W or WH. It leverages the capabilities of the microcontroller found in the Raspberry Pi Pico, enabling it to emulate both a 64 KB and 128 KB ROMs by simply loading the binary files from a micro SD card or via a Wi-Fi connection. So that allows you to load alternate ROMs and versions of ROMs on your ST. It can also interact with the cartridge bus in real time for data reading and writing, which allows for seamless emulation of different devices such as floppy drives and hard drives. So this is a very inexpensive way to get a lot of functionality, including virtual floppy and hard drives on your ST. I can't wait to start playing with this when I get time to do so. And that's it for new acquisitions this month.
My name is Forrest Mims. I've written many electronics and scientific books and articles, and I co-founded MITS. I also wrote the first manual for the Altair 8800 computer. You're listening to the Floppy Days Podcast.
All right, now let's go over upcoming vintage computer or vintage gaming shows. At this time of the year, being February, the event season is really just starting to get kicked off, so there's a ton of them here to go through, but I'll try to go through them quickly. In April, the same weekend, April 4th through the 6th for the next two shows here, Midwest Gaming Classic at the Baird Center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Also VCF East in Wall, New Jersey. April 12th through the 13th will be the Indie Classic Computer and Video Game Expo at the Crowne Plaza Airport Hotel in Indianapolis, Indiana. April 26th through the 27th is the Commodore Los Angeles Super Show at the Burbank VFW Hall in Burbank, California. May 2nd through the 3rd is the 32nd annual Last Chicago Cocoa Fest at the Holiday Inn and Suites, Chicago Carol Stream in Carol Stream, Illinois. May 3rd through the 4th, so that same weekend, is VCF Europe in Munich, Germany. June 14th is the Vancouver Retro Gaming Expo in New Westminster, British Columbia, Canada. June 20th through the 22nd is VCF Southwest at the Davidson Gundy Alumni Center at the University of Texas, Dallas. Same weekend, June 20th through the 22nd, is Southern Fried Gaming Expo combined with VCF Southeast in Atlanta, Georgia. Also the same weekend, 21st through the 22nd, is the Pacific Commodore Expo Northwest at the Old Rainier Brewery Intraspace in Seattle, Washington. July 31st through August 3rd is the Silly Venture Summer Edition in Gdansk, Poland. August 11th through the 17th is Fujiyama in Langenfeld, Germany. The big one, September 13th through the 14th, VCF Midwest at the Renaissance Schaumburg Convention Center in Schaumburg, Illinois. September 26th through the 28th is Tandy Assembly at the Courtyard by Marriott in Springfield, Ohio. October 17th through the 19th is the Portland Retro Gaming Expo at the Oregon Convention Center in Portland, Oregon. And finally, to round out the year, on October 25th is the Chicago TI International World Fair at the Evanston Public Library in Evanston, Illinois. Note that I have this full schedule published on the Floppy Days website. Go to the website to find it, or find the link in the show notes for this episode. And that's it for upcoming shows. And now we have the interview and HP9767 history discussion with co-host Wlodek Mier-Jedrzejowicz, HP calculator historian. All right, I'm here today with Wlodek. How are you, sir?
I'm fine, thank you. Delighted to be with you.
Excellent. So maybe you can start us out by just telling us where you live and what it is you do these days.
Well, I live in London, England, not London, Ontario, or London in South Africa, the big London. I stopped working at Imperial College, where I had some very interesting scientific moments in my career, and I now spend my time, I'm still doing some information technology work, mostly accounting actually, which is pretty tiresome compared to programming, but necessary for some people. I also do quite a lot of work in social organizations. I chair our local residents association. I chair the Handheld and Portable Computer Club for HP users, which has been going in London, Britain, and now worldwide for over 40 years. And I do work in all sorts of Polish organizations. We have a Polish newspaper that's published in London, various other organizations, but that's probably of less interest. And I spend masses of time playing with HP calculators, writing about them, and also my other hobby is photography.
Well, that sounds like a lot. It sounds like you're keeping pretty busy these days.
Still keeping busy, yes.
So I'm very interested in knowing you're really a HP calculator historian. I mean, I think you're pretty well known as that. How did you get started with HP calculators? What's the story there?
Well, okay, when handheld calculators came in, I couldn't afford an HP, and HP hadn't made them yet. I had some other models first, and then in my second year at physics and mathematics at my university, the spectroscopy people became very agitated and excited that Hewlett-Packard were going to produce a calculator that was scientific and had 10-digit accuracy. Spectroscopy is one of those sciences where you get 10 or even 12 digits of accuracy. It's astounding. In many fields, you're lucky with 2 or 3 digits, but in spectroscopy, it's 10. So this was going to be a scientific calculator with 10-digit accuracy. And they had advertisements first from the United States and then Britain, and it was going to use reverse Polish notation. And guess what? I consider myself as Polish as I consider myself British, so that sounded exciting. That was the first. And then they started importing them from the United States, and we couldn't afford them as students, but in the lab, they put them up, just a few, on long stalks with a platform at the top. And when you had some calculation to do, you went to the front of the lab and you waited to use one of these calculators and you did your calculation on it. And then you went back and measured some more. So that was the first use of a 35 and of an HP calculator I had.
So that was the HP35. Okay.
Yes.
So how many calculators then did you end up owning over the years?
That's an excellent question. I must have well over 100 because I gradually, the first HP calculator I could afford to buy was an HP25. I was finishing my PhD thesis. I wanted to go off and stay with my uncle and aunt in the country, far away from any computers. And of course, you didn't have online access to computers. So I needed something I could program and do some calculations. So I bought that secondhand. And then nothing more till the HP41C and CV came out. And then we set up a British branch of the US Calculator Users Group. And then gradually I built them up, and then I realized I was actually writing histories of them. So gradually I bought until I have virtually one of every single one that HP made, and in some cases several.
Well, that's a lot, because I know HP made a lot of different models. Did you always only get the HP? You didn't get TI or any of the other
well,
models?
Before I could even afford them, I had a Sinclair Oxford 300. My parents bought me that for Christmas. Then I bought myself a Commodore. Then I started the HPs. But along the way, you get to buy other calculators. For a long time, I used Casio pocket-sized, credit card-sized calculators, this size, which were made in the 1970s. And they had alarms built into them, as well as scientific functions. So for a long time, those are the ones I carried around with me. And these days, when I buy HPs, something else often comes in the box. And I bought several TI-30s because I was writing about comparisons of those with HP models. At one stage, HP made ones very similar to them. HP at various times have made models similar to other companies or have even shared a design because they're buying from a Chinese company which makes calculators for everyone, including them.
Okay. So at some point you said you kind of grew into being a historian, and you've written, I believe, multiple books, right?
Yes.
Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, well, we set up a branch of the US HP Calculator Group, PPC, in London. Well, it wasn't in London, it was in Britain. We ended up having most of our meetings in London, but we originally had meetings all over the country. And I was going to these meetings and sharing calculator programs I had written with other people. And eventually I decided to write a book of them. So I wrote a book about HP41 programs, and then I found I'd written a book about the HP41 in general, quite a thick book, which people really enjoyed. So I wrote a similar one about the HP28 series, which had come out soon after. And then somewhat at the prompting of my publisher, and I feel of HP themselves, I wrote a book about the HP32, which was a much simpler, cheaper model, but with fractions on it for university students and graduates. At that point, I stopped writing books about specific models, and I decided to write a book about all of them, both for collectors and for historians. So I had already collected several models, and I gradually built up a complete collection and wrote about the background, the history, and then about every single model and how they came in families, and then a few appendices. And since then, I've not written any more HP books, but I've been updating this one until HP stopped making new models 10 years ago. So I stopped updating it 10 years ago, and it's high time I updated it.
Yeah, I mean, they've haven't they come out with some new models fairly recently, like the Prime, or isn't
The
there?
Prime, I think, came out in 2012. Since then, they have made new versions of calculators they already make. The simplest models, for example, they've got something called the HP10. It's become the HP10 2, and now they've released something called the HP10 Plus. But they're all basically the same model. They have also released a reissue of one of their most popular calculators, the 15C. Years ago, they released something called the 15C limited edition. It was just a remake of the 15C. And last year, they released something called the 15C collector's edition, which is another reissue. Because the technology has changed, they've had to redo the basic software, and you find that there are errors in it that weren't in the original calculator, so you have to do a whole lot of beta testing again. And it still often has errors that the original doesn't have in.
Oh, really? Okay.
Those are the new models.
Yeah. Okay. So what does your collection look like today? You said you've got every model that HP ever made?
Except the new one that they've made called the HP10S Plus, which strangely has been released only in Australia and New Zealand. That's where they ran out of the 10S, and they made a new batch called the 10S Plus, but only sell them there. And I haven't yet managed to import one from Australia.
Gotcha. Okay. Do you have any other, did you ever get into vintage computers at all? Do you have any, I know HP made some computers as well as many other manufacturers, but did you ever get into that at all?
Not really. When we stopped using PDP computers in the space physics division where I was working in, I actually gave them to a friend, Tony Jewell, who is one of our super enthusiastic calculator and computer users and specialists. I have since then occasionally got an odd computer. I've got an original BBC micro, BBC made computers for educational purposes in Britain. But it's not something that I specifically collect. The calculators take up quite enough space as it is.
I'm sure. Yeah, but you got to have an HP85 or something like that sitting on your desk too,
I should. All I've got are a few old IBM PCs. Oh, I do have a couple of very nice CPM machines on which I wrote my original book. They were CPM graphics computers made by North Star.
All right.
Very nice CPM computer designed for graphics. And they were in use in the computing department, not the computational department which provide computing power in our university, but the computer sciences department. We had two computer departments, and they had stopped using those. They'd already got something better. So I inherited some CPM machines, and I wrote my book on them, and one of them is still standing on my table.
Okay, excellent. Well, hey, that's great. I appreciate you telling listeners a little bit about yourself and how you became an HP computer, or I'm sorry, HP calculator.
Yes.
Expert.
Yeah.
But if you're up for it, I'd like to go ahead and move into the topic of today's podcast, which is the HP97 and by association, the HP67, since they were basically the same machine.
Indeed.
So I'd like to jump in and talk about the history a little bit and how the 97 and 67 came about and, just a little bit of the initial history of those machines.
All right. Well, in a nutshell, HP produced the first scientific calculator, the HP35. It was great. It sold very well, and they decided to upgrade it. They produced an HP45, so they just added 10 to the number, and that worked very well. When I was working on a British satellite project, the engineer was using an HP45. That was already 20 years old, and people are still using them now. Then HP produced something called the HP65, which was programmable. absolutely amazing. They had also produced the HP55, which was better than the 45 and had a timer built in. So they were incrementing the model number by 10 each time. And then they had, by then, already made business calculators too, the HP80 and the HP70. So they were running out of model numbers because they had something beginning with a 3, a 4, a 5, a 6, and a 7, and an 8. And they introduced the HP20 series, a whole series of models with numbers beginning with 2, quite small ones. They then introduced a series beginning with 9s, bigger ones. They were still handheld calculators, but they were big enough to put down on a table, and you didn't really want to carry it in your pocket. You kept it in your drawer when you went home and locked the drawer. And the 20 series introduced better technology, better chips, and they used these to upgrade the HP65 first programmable calculator to something called the HP67. At the same time, they felt that they could make a model with the same feature set, but that would be a member of the printable desktop calculators. So they called that the 97. So they introduced in 1976 a pair of calculators with the same instruction set. You could store programs and data on magnetic cards, and the magnetic cards were interchangeable between these two models. So you could have a 67, which you carried around home, lab, wherever you traveled with it. And then when you wanted to print things out, you could use the same program in the 97, and there was a print function instead of enable display. So you could display a result on your 67 or print it on the 97. The 97 was bigger, it therefore had more keys. You didn't have to use loads of shift keys as you did on the 67. It just stood on your desktop. It was a great scientific calculator. You could program it to do business, architecture, whatever else you wanted. But it appeared as a technical calculator with lots of features initially. So there you had an HP97, wonderful calculator. The display was bigger as well as printing, so you could see the display from a greater distance. You could have it at one end of the lab and you could go back to your experiment and still see what the numbers were. Some people with very poor eyesight would put a magnifying glass over the display, and it was probably the first calculator that people with really poor eyesight could use. And there are people still wanting it and using it because that's the one that they can see.
Huh. Okay. Yeah.
So
I
it
know,
introduced a whole load of new features. It introduced the ability to do extensive scientific programming and print your results before the PC, basically. Well, there were PCs coming out by then, but it was really quite a capable alternative.
So I just recently got an HP97. I don't own a 67. One of the reasons that it intrigued me so much, and I just felt like I had to have one, is it reminded me a lot of the TI-59 and the associated PC-100C printer.
Yes.
You know, that you could dock the 59 into. And were those out at about the same time? Was there competition there, or is that something that HP came out with theirs first?
I think the 97 came out first, and then TI had the brilliant idea of, instead of having two models, you had one model, and if you needed to, you could dock it in a printer.
Yeah.
HP followed that up with the 41 series, which instead of having two models like the 67 and the 97, you had a 41, and you didn't have a docking printer, you had a plug-in printer. But TI came up with the idea first, I believe, though Casio and Sharp had already been thinking about producing, well, no, programmable pocket computers came a bit later with printers, but it was again the same idea. No, TI were very clever with the PC100 docking station.
I do like having the printer built into the machine, though, the way the 97 is. Maybe we can, at this point in time, do you still have the HP97 sitting there on your
I have
desk?
one sitting next to me, yes.
Yeah, maybe we can just take a look at it real quick. There we go. Yeah, it's it's fairly large, but it's not as large as the combination, 59 100C.
And it's not as heavy.
Not as heavy, right? But it's a pretty cool machine. Do you have a 67 as well?
I have a 67. I didn't think to bring one to show.
Okay.
I can show one later if we take a coffee break, or people can look it up on the websites we'll talk about.
Okay. Well, later we're going to talk about the aesthetics of that machine.
Okay.
And what it's like, when you're pulling one out of the box. So if you'll keep it handy, we can pull it up again.
So I'll show it again. There are some features I'd like to point out, but we can talk about that later.
Okay. Very good. Anything else on the history front? So it actually, both machines, you said they came out in 76. They were discontinued it looks like in 1982 for the
67 was discontinued in 1982, and HP told users that they should stop using the 97 and they should buy a 41 and a printer instead. And people said no. They still like the combined printer and calculator, and they still like the big display. So HP carried on making the 97 for another 2 years. But then they stopped anyway.
Did you ever hear any numbers as to how well the 6797 sold?
I'm afraid not, and I never asked. I was actually asked by HP how many HP12C units they thought I thought they had made.
Yeah.
I think they didn't have, well, they probably do have a record somewhere, but they asked me about that. But there must have been tens of thousands sold every year, and that was 8 years running that they were selling them. So the numbers available around must run into the hundreds of thousands.
But I know they're not that difficult to get, and later we'll talk about buying one today. Yes. But if you go to look on eBay and places like that, if you want to buy a 97, although they go for a fair amount of money, there's a lot of them out there. So it's not like they either hold up a lot, really well, or there were a lot of them made, or both.
I think both. It was a very useful machine. It was more or less unique in what it did. So shopkeepers, business users, as well as scientists bought them. So you might pick some up. They were probably used by NASA and the Department of Defense, as well as many, many shopkeepers. So they keep coming out of the woodwork. Someone sells up their store and they find in a drawer one that was used 20 or 30 years ago.
And now we have the interview with Everett Kaser with his memories of working at HP and repairing the HP97. Well, hey, I appreciate you taking some time here. I just wanted to, as we talked, I'm going to do a show on the HP97, and you said you had at least a story or some memories, I guess, of the HP97 while you were working for HP, and I just wanted to capture that if I could and get that on the podcast when that happens. So,
okay.
Tell us what you know about the HP97. What memories do you have of that particular machine?
Well, when I started at HP, which was late 76, there was production consisted of the Woodstock line of calculators, which were the Series 20, and the 65 and the 97, the 67 and the 97. And the 67 and the 97 were essentially identical products, except that one was a handheld and the other had a built-in printer.
Right.
But the logic and all the ROMs, everything was basically the same otherwise. 97 was Topcat, was the code name. I can't remember what the 67 was. I think it was like Bobcat or I don't remember the 67's code name. Anyway, after I'd been working in production was divided into two parts. There was prefab or logic board assembly, and then the other half was final assembly. And I was working in the prefab portion, which went all the way from preforming resistors and ICs, which is where I started, all the way up through test and repair of the logic boards. And then once those were tested, they went to final assembly, and that's where they put the cases and the logic board and the batteries and displays and everything in. And after I'd been working there about 6 months, they started moving me through the various stations fairly quickly until I got to test and repair. And the test and repair area was where, once the boards had all been assembled, the parts had been loaded in by hand, and then the boards were run through the wave soldering machine, and then backloading and touch up clipped off leads on the backs of the boards, and there were some parts that got hand soldered onto the backs of the boards. And then those boards came to test and repair, where they'd get clamped onto a test fixture to check out their full functionality without them having to be built into a product first. It was basically a fold apart test fixture where there was a keyboard already pre-mounted and a display mounted, and you just took the logic board and clamped it down onto contacts, and it made a functioning calculator.
Okay, sure.
And at one point, the demand was high enough that the test and repair area couldn't keep up with the demand of, final assembly they needed to ship product to fill all the orders, which meant that final assembly needed working logic boards to build the final product. Well, the boards were coming through test and repair, but some would fail. But in order to get enough going through to satisfy the downstream production, a lot of the boards that failed just went into boxes so that we could keep testing and shoving out the good working boards. And so we started building up kind of a inventory. There was a couple of wire racks, floor standing 6 foot tall wire racks, several of those filled with boxes that were filled with non-functioning logic boards. And finally, the management said, "Hey, we've got a crap ton of money tied up in these logic boards, and we're getting behind. We got to get those out of there." And so they said they can work overtime. We'll pay overtime for people in the test and repair area to work overtime. We got to get those things repaired and out of there. And so probably for, I don't know, 3 or 4 months, we were working 10-hour days, 5 days a week, trying to not only keep enough good stuff going that was being manufactured to final assembly, but also work our way through the backlog of non-functional logic boards.
Mm-hmm.
And when that came to an end, it kind of hurt because you kind of got used to that overtime check.
Yeah, I imagine.
But
so there were that. So how many people were actually doing it besides yourself?
The test and repair area.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember for sure, but I would, thinking back, trying to visualize the test stations. Of course, you had some people would work on the Woodstock calculators. That was their job. Is you had stations for the various Woodstock calculators, and stations for the 67 and stations for the 97, and all of these were pretty much running at the same time. They do them in batches. So sometimes you'd have both Woodstock and 97 parts coming through, or you'd have 97 and 67 parts coming through. And we'd work on both, but generally we tended to focus on one particular one because all three were really happening at the same time. And I spent most of my time on the 97. Testing and repairing the 97. I don't remember. I know I did, but I don't remember as much working on the 67 or the Woodstocks in test and repair. So I'm guessing there was probably, I don't know, somewhere between 8 and 12 people in test and repair that were testing and repair. Some people were just testing, and if it failed, they passed it off and kept testing, and they were just doing testing. The more experienced people then were doing repair, would focus on repair work, and that's what you were doing. I can remember doing both testing. I mean, it varied as if there was a backlog of if there's a bunch of broken boards that needed to be repaired, or not broken, but non-functional, you'd switch over and you'd be working on those. And if those got back cleaned up, then you'd switch back to just doing straight testing. I'm saying there's probably about 8 to 12 people, but I don't remember exactly how many were working the overtime on the repair portion. It was probably six or 8 people.
Wow.
Trying to get that backlog out. And I'd say that there was probably, well, I don't know, there were hundreds, many hundreds of logic boards that were in the backlog that needed to be repaired. At one point, when the test process was basically for both the 67 and the 97 was you'd clamp down the logic board, and you had a couple of magnetic strips that you'd run through the reader to load a test program to test out all the functionality. And if it passed all those tests, then unclamp it and off it goes to final assembly. Well, one of the tests was a memory test, testing all of the registers, the RAM. Basically, it was I forget, it was 144 bytes of RAM, something like that. But some of it was used for other things. So the test program basically consisted of 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus all the way through for 128 steps. And if all of the memory was good, you'd run this through and you hit run, and it'd flicker. It was real quick. It took a while to work through all these 1 plus 1 pluses through 128 times. Not a long time, but anyway, at the end it'd display the result, which should be 128. And if it wasn't 128, that meant that something was wrong in one of the RAM chips. And there were 2 RAM chips, so the memory was divided in half. And even within those, the memory was in blocks of 8. I think it's very similar to this. If I haven't got it exactly right, it was essentially that. And usually, if anything went wrong, a whole block would fail. So you'd lose the count in these blocks. And if it wasn't right, you just had to desolder one of the memory chips and solder a fresh one in and retest it. And if that didn't work, then you desolder the other one and solder a new one in and retest it. And hopefully one of the ones you soldered in wasn't a bad chip. Well, after I'd worked there for a little, I don't know, some number of weeks or a month or two, I thought, this seems, having to just take a random shot guess at which chip it is seems silly. Why don't we should pause the program halfway through, because the memory was all contiguous. So the first half of the counting was one chip and the second half was another chip. So I went, but at the time, I wasn't very experienced yet, so I didn't feel I could go to the engineers, the production engineers myself, and say, hey, your test program sucks. You really need to break it in half so we know which chip it is. But I went to the tech that was working, the technician that was working there in the assembly area, and told him about my idea. And he said, that's a good idea. So he went and talked to the production engineer, and before you know it, we have a new test program that would pause. You'd hit run and it'd count up and pause at the halfway point, so you'd know if the first half was okay, and then you'd hit continue or run, I forget what it was, and it'd continue on and finish up, and you'd know whether the second half was good. So that way you only had to desolder one chip.
Was that the most common issue? Was RAM being bad?
Well, I wouldn't say it was the most common issue. The most common issue is probably a solder bridge or a cold solder joint.
Oh.
Because these, they'd hand load all these parts into the board, and the board would be on a tray, and they'd load these trays into a cart. And then when the cart was full, or at the end of the day, the cart goes over to the wave solder machine, and they pull them out and stick them on the track, the conveyor belt going into the wave solderer. One at a time, they'd hand load these trays on there, and the tray would go through, and it was a wave. The solder was in a big molten vat, and it was pumped up over into, it was kind of a wave right in the middle. And as the board went over the top, it would skim over this wave, and the solder would get sucked up into the holes and around the legs of the components. And when it came out of there, depending on how much flux there was in the solder and whether the moon was full or who knows, when it came out, the touch-up and back loading, they'd go through and clip some of the leads off that were too long, because in some of the calculator cases, they needed to be short enough so that they weren't in the way of the plastic of the case. And they'd backload parts on, but they weren't doing any real inspection for solder bridges or cold solder joints or anything. Their job was just to clip stuff off, backload on the few parts that had to go on the back, and move that board on to test and repair. So frequently there'd be a little extra glob of solder between adjacent pins or across traces that weren't, most of the traces were supposed to be covered by a solder resistant layer, but sometimes it wouldn't be real good, and the trace would be exposed, and you get a solder bridge across from trace to trace, or pin to pin, pad to pad. So that was probably the largest problem, was that. Sometimes you'd have a capacitor or a resistor that would be bad, but they were pretty reliable. That wasn't a big issue. It was usually either a solder problem or a bad IC, and it could be a RAM chip. It could be the CPU. It wasn't just a CPU. It was basically keyboard scanner, and all kinds of stuff went into that main chip, the processor chip. So it depends, but RAM was certainly a fairly common failure. And then they'd take those, once the units were assembled at final assembly, they'd go into a heat chamber for 24 hours. They'd be plugged into a rack in there and be running a program for 24 hours to catch infant mortality, because frequently when a unit heated up, a component, whether it's a chip or a resistor capacitor, might function when you just clamp it down on the tester and run it, and it's kind of cool. But when it heats up, that can trigger a part's almost ready to fail. It manages to work, but it's almost ready to fail. Putting the heat room running for 24 hours will frequently cause a bunch of those to fail. Those then have to get torn apart, and the logic boards would come back to us to be retested and rerun again. And so there was a certain amount of recirculation there.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Do you remember what the rate of failure was on those, or do you have any idea what it was?
The infant mortality failure wasn't very high, I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
It was there, but it wasn't very high. But it was high enough that at the time, HP didn't want that stuff going out into the field and fail. They wanted, when a customer paid high dollar value for their calculators, because they were at the time they called it the Cadillac of calculators. TI was, they were definitely second class.
Right.
Um, they wanted it to be a really rock solid device, so that's why they ran it through the heat chamber for 24 hours. And the Woodstock calculators, the Series 20, the case was most of the case, all the sides of the case were one solid chunk of heavy, thick plastic. Everything except for the keyboard, the face of the calculator. The top face of the calculator was the keyboard and the display, and it snapped down inside the rest of the case. So the rest of the case actually wrapped up around the sides of the keyboard and the display, which made for a really rugged calculator. You could throw the thing across the room and hit the wall, and it wouldn't care. It'd still work just fine. You could run over it with a car, and 9 times out of 10, it might get scuffed up a little bit, but it'd still work. It was really tough. Later on, after I had moved on into the R&D lab, they came out with the Series 30 calculators, which were supposed to be, they were this guy in the lab's idea that, hey, we're gonna make this calculator that's quick and easy to assemble and really low cost to assemble. And the idea was that all the circuitry would be on a flexible membrane that would get inside this plastic carrier, let's say, and then the chips would be loaded. The legs on the ICs came up and then bent and went out at a 90-degree angle. So they were very much like an insect with feet sticking out. And you loaded these chips upside down on top of this membrane that was on top of this plastic plate. And when most of the resistors and everything were also in the ICs, there were very few discrete parts other than the ICs. And you loaded all these in, and then there was another plate that came down on top of it. And there was a little kind of, and then clips that went along the side that held these two plates together. So there was no soldering. I mean, it was a great idea. It was load, clip, and you're ready to go. The problem was that the case itself also was in two pieces that came together like a clamshell and got screwed together. But what they found out was, after it was in production, was that if you took the case and twisted it a little bit, like you're wringing out a towel, only not quite that hard, and just a slight twist, that caused these two plates inside to flex and bend. The clips inside weren't holding these two tightly enough together, and the legs would lose contact, and all you need is one leg to lose contact with that circuit, that flexible circuit, and you're hosed. And so they had a high failure rate on those, and that was a horrible design. But the 20 and the 67 and the 97, those were the apex of HP's calculator line. The 41 came out between the 67, 97 and the Series 30. I mean, there was a number of different levels there. The 41 was a great calculator, also, but that Series 30, that was a bad news.
Okay, very cool. Any other thoughts about the 67, 97?
I really can't think of anything else. It's been a long time ago.
Sure.
But I do remember that whole test and repair process, and when we got into that backlog. And I remember one time, this was in the late 70s. And so Bill and Dave were still very much involved in the business, in running heading up the business. But for somebody that just started at HP within a year or two, they were like these legends that you heard about, and you heard all of these stories about Bill and Dave, and
Hewitt and
it was a great company.
Hewitt and Packard?
Yeah. Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that so course, we were up here in Corvallis, and they were down in the Bay Area, so they hadn't been up to visit. I hadn't seen them. Well, one time, one of them, I don't remember if it was Hewlett or Packard. One of them was coming for a division review or something, and they did a tour through production. And at the time, management, there was a rule from management that you couldn't have a radio or a tape player or whatever playing music in production. I guess they figured that we're all there working together, and they didn't want one person's music offending somebody else or distracting people that were from working. I don't know what the reasoning was, but there was a rule you weren't supposed to have a radio or a cassette player broadcasting music in the production area. Well, I and one of the other test and repair people, so they were sitting side by side on this one table in the test and repair. I had brought in there were a lot of these cardboard boxes that were about maybe 10 inches wide by 8 or 9 inches deep by maybe 3 inches high, and those were used to store logic boards in, or a wide variety of things, but we used them for storing logic boards in. That's what all these bad logic boards went into before they went on these wire racks. So anyway, I had one of those boxes empty that I put a cassette player in and plugged at the time that there were headphone speakers that were just they were kind of like the early earbuds, except they were on a wire, and they were a cup that just kind of hung over you could hang it over your ear. So they weren't tied together over the top of your head or anything. It was 2 wires came up, one to each one, and you'd hang one over each ear, and that was your headphones. Well, I had a pair of those and this small cassette player, and I put them in this cardboard box with the lid closed. And so one of the headphones were basically the speakers, and we were playing music on the Simon. At the time, the one I remember is Simon and Garfunkel, because the guy next to me and we'd be sitting there working, and there was one song, Homeward Bound, or Home Where My Thoughts. I won't try singing. Anyway, we'd kind of sing along with that and singing. We had a good time with that. Well, this trail of management comes through production that day with I think it was Dave Packard. They come through, and one of the managers kind of starts looking around like they could hear that music. It wasn't very loud. It was just loud enough that the two of us that are sitting at our table could hear it. But as they're walking past the table, they're kind of going, where's that music coming from? Well, they never found out. We never got in trouble, but not that has much to do with the calculators, but
Just
that was one
other
thing.
Working at HP, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, very cool. I won't take up any more of your time then, Everett. I really appreciate you talking through that. And
Okay, Randy. Hope that helped you some.
thank you. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
You do the same.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, that's it for this episode of the Floppy Days Podcast. I want to give special thanks to Wlodek Mier-Jedrzejowicz and Everett Kaser for their help in producing this podcast. I really appreciate the time they spent in going through the history of the HP97 in Wlodek's case, and memories of repairing the HP97 in the case of Everett Kaser. I provided links in the show notes for all the great websites we discussed during this podcast. Go to floppydays.com for the full list. I always encourage you to provide feedback for the show, and you can do that at Apple Podcasts, on the website, via email at floppydays@gmail.com, via X or Twitter at floppydays, on Mastodon at floppydays, at oldbytes.space, at Blue Sky at floppydays.bsky.social, on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/floppydays, or on the Discord server whose link is at floppydays.com. Floppy Days is available for streaming at multiple places, and besides the website and Apple Podcasts, you can also stream it from TuneIn, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Spotify. Until the next show, pull out a vintage computer and compute as if it were yesterday. Bye.